So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today and welcome to today's Norms and Behavioral Change Talk. My name is Angela Jiang Wang, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics at the University of Pennsylvania. Just for you to know, this seminar will be recorded and we will upload the video to our YouTube channel and to our website. So moving to today's agenda, we have two very interesting talks for you. We start with a brief talk by an early career researcher, Jenny Chang from Carnegie Mellon University, which will be followed by the main talk by Valerio Capraro from University of Milan Bicocca. And after these talks, we will have a brief Q&A segment open to all participants towards the end of the session. And then for anyone who might be new to this, NoBeC talks are organized by the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics here at Penn, with the support of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program, and in partnership with the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program. The center itself is a research center which provides specialized consulting, research, and training services to organizations throughout the world seeking to enact positive behavioral change. Here you can see the schedule of the upcoming NoBeC talks. You can register for these talks on our website or you can scan the QR code right here. And also just for you to know, we usually publish the titles and abstracts of these talks about 1 week before each talk on our website and in our newsletter. So you can also sign up to your newsletter if you want to receive updates about future talks. And lastly, before we turn to our speakers, please just note a few ground rules. So first, you should be automatically muted when you join, but if you are not, please kindly mute yourself. And if possible, please keep your camera on so we can make this session more interactive. If you have questions, you can use the chat at any time, or you can raise your hand at the end in the Q&A segment. And as I said before, the recordings of these sessions will be uploaded to our website and YouTube channel. So our first presentation today is by an early career researcher, Jenny Chang. Jenny Chang is a PhD candidate in the Department of Social and Decision Sciences at Carnegie Mellon University. Her research leverages insights from economics and psychology to study how information frictions contribute to social and economic inequality using experimental methods. Some of her work in this area has explored gender differences in self-promotion and their downstream consequences for labor market outcomes. Her other work studies how information and misperceptions shape prosocial behavior and interpersonal understanding. So Jenny's presentation today is on when women self-promote, evidence on beliefs and downstream consequences. Before we move to the talk, I just want to remind you that if any questions come up during the presentation, just feel free to put them in the chat. So now I will stop sharing my screen so you can present, Jenny. Thank you so much for joining us today.
All right, thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen. Just let me know if you can't. But thank you so much. Like Angela said, my name is Jenny Chang. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Social and Decision Sciences at Carnegie Mellon, and I am very excited to be here today to share some of my research with you. This is joint with Sylvia Sicardo and Gretchen Chapman on the career consequences of self-promotion for women. So to begin, I want to highlight quickly, there are persistent gender disparities in labor market outcomes. So women continue to earn less than men, and research suggests women face disadvantages across nearly every stage of the career pipeline. So in my work, I'm really interested in understanding why women aren't being recognized to the same extent as equally performing men. And I think part of the answer may be that being recognized, it's not always just about being the most hardworking or skilled, but it's really also about whether your contributions and skills are getting noticed by others. So behaviors like self-promotion or communicating some information about your competencies, it could be one potential contributor to these gender gaps in labor market outcomes. But at the same time, there's this widespread concern that for women, self-promotion will backfire, as you see reflected in this kind of popular media. But does self-promotion actually yield different returns for men and women? While there is prior research in psychology and management suggesting yes, women face these distinct penalties for behaviors that highlight their competence, in part because this kind of behavior violates prescriptive norms about how women should behave. But on taking a closer look at the influential studies in this literature, like I put in this table here, you can see that these are vignette studies that elicit self-reported judgments, like how hireable is this candidate? And none of these measures are elicited in incentive-compatible ways. So I think it's unclear whether these findings generalize to consequential labor market outcomes. So in this paper, our goal is to provide a test of the impacts of self-promotion for men and women in consequential settings, and I use pre-registered experiments in both the field and the lab. And we're going to study 3 stages of the career where we think self-promotion may make a difference, and I'm going to describe this in more detail later on. But first, I want to show you some motivating data on beliefs. So we surveyed people online to understand who they think benefits more from self-promotion, men or women, across the settings we're actually going to look at. And so today I'm going to show you these graphs plotting relative beliefs. Values above 0 here would indicate beliefs that self-promotion, women benefit more from self-promotion than men. And values below 0 would indicate beliefs that men benefit more from these behaviors. So when we look at responses from men, you can see men perceive little difference. Self-promotion is going to similarly impact outcomes regardless of the self-promoter's gender. By contrast, for women, the difference is noticeably larger across all of our contexts. So women are more likely to believe self-promotion benefits men to a greater extent than women. And these kinds of beliefs may mean women are hesitating more when thinking about engaging in self-promotion in the workplace. So does self-promotion yield different returns? Well, women would say yes. Self-promotion yields lower returns for women than for men. Are these beliefs accurate? First, I'm going to show you this field experiment looking at the context of seeking support through professional networks, where you may ask for things like favors or advice from colleagues. And self-promotion here, it may influence whether people want to invest their time or resources into you. So here we emailed over 66,000 researchers this real request to complete a survey for an ongoing project we had. And this was a 2x2 design where we sent 4 different versions of the email. And I'm not going to have time to show you the exact language today, but what we did is first we vary whether the email includes self-promotion or whether there's language about the credentials of the research team in the email or no mention of credentials. And we also vary whether the team's all-female composition is emphasized or whether gender is not revealed at all. Okay, so what kind of language helps? I'm going to show you today the average likelihood of opening the survey for each email. You can see compared to our control, we're finding no significant impact of just revealing this is an all-female team of researchers. We find adding self-promotional language to the email helps. It increases the likelihood that a researcher will open our survey. But the question is, does self-promotion help for women? And as you can see, yes, we find no significant interaction between self-promotion and revealing the gender of the team. So self-promotion helps even when it's known that this is coming from an all-female team. So although there are these beliefs that self-promotion will be less effective for women, in our field experiment, we find no evidence of this. Okay, for our next 2 contexts, we're going to move to the lab in a simulated hiring experiment. We'll look at what happens when you self-promote. Does it increase the chances of being hired? And then what happens later down the line? To give you a high-level overview, participants here were assigned to the role of employers, and they evaluated a series of worker profiles. Now, these profiles were constructed from a real study where workers took a math test and could self-promote about their performance. So for each worker, employers decide, do I want to hire the worker and rely on their performance for my bonus? Or do I want to not hire the worker and receive a potentially smaller but guaranteed bonus? And this allows us to look at how self-promotion impacts men and women's likelihood of being hired. And for each hired worker, we give employers an additional performance signal. Did the worker meet expectations or did they fall short? And after this, we ask employers to make another decision about whether they'd like to rely on the worker's performance again, this time on a follow-up task, or take a guaranteed bonus. And this allows us to look at what happens later on. Maybe self-promotion, it helps you get your foot in the door, but it could also raise expectations of your performance later on, such that there are harsher penalties if you underperform later down the line. And we're particularly interested in whether these penalties are greater for women. So this is an example of a worker profile that employers saw. Remember, these profiles are created from real worker data we collected in another experiment. And these profiles vary on three key dimensions. First, the gender of the workers revealed through a gendered avatar and pronouns. We also inform employers of the worker's score on 3 out of the 10 math questions they answered. So there's some limited information about the worker's abilities. And the profile can include a self-promotional message if the worker opted to include one. So if the employer hires this worker, their bonus depends on the worker's performance that they don't see on the profile relative to the performance of a random benchmark worker we'll compare them to. Then after all hiring decisions, employers learn about this outcome. Did this worker meet expectations by outperforming their benchmark worker, in which case the employer would receive a bonus? Or did they fail to meet expectations by not outperforming their benchmark worker? Now employers are again asked to make another decision. Do you want to rely on this worker again, this time their performance on a follow-up task, or take a guaranteed bonus? So first I'm going to show you what happens in the hiring stage. And you can see that in our experiment, self-promotion increases the likelihood of being hired, both for men and women. And importantly, self-promotion is actually helping equally for men and women. We find no evidence of backlash or differential effects. But what happens after a success or a failure? And we can actually observe this in the second stage of our experiment, where employers get an additional signal and make another decision about whether to rely on the worker. So what do we see in the second stage? You see when workers meet expectations, they're very likely to be relied on again. Self-promotion, it doesn't really have an impact on this decision, either for men or women. When workers underperform or fall short of expectations, you can see there's this big penalty, which is not surprising. They just got a negative signal, but this isn't differentially greater for men or women, and it's actually not differentially greater for workers who self-promote. So in other words, we're finding that men and women equally benefit from self-promotion when they're trying to be hired, and they're not penalized for self-promoting even if they fail to meet expectations later down the line. So overall, what do we find? We find consistent beliefs that men and women face different consequences for self-promotion, especially from women, which may contribute to gender differences in how men and women engage in these behaviors in the workplace. But our work today, it suggests that these concerns seem to be at least somewhat disproportionate to the actual potential costs, as in these same contexts, we're finding self-promotion that improves outcomes equally for men and women. And so in my ongoing and future research, I'm really interested in trying to understand when and why backlash may manifest in some contexts, but not others, which I think can help us better understand how to increase women's visibility in the workplace. That's all I have today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for your presentation. Really, really interesting. We actually have a couple of minutes before we need to move on to the main talk. So if anyone has any questions for Jenny, you can raise your hand and ask. And actually, while we're waiting to see if anyone has any questions, I might go first, Jenny. I do have a question for you. So it was so interesting finding out that women had these beliefs that if they self-promote, they might receive this backlash, and this might be leading to them self-promoting less. But I was also wondering if it could also be because women are less confident usually than men in their abilities, right? So what if women are afraid of to underperform, and that's why they fear that the self-promotion will have a penalty, while maybe men are more optimistic that they will not underperform? Do you think that could be an alternative explanation?
Yeah, that's such an interesting, great question, Angela. Actually, in some of my other work, we actually look at gender differences in self-promotional behaviors and their mechanisms. And we're finding indeed that part of this thing seems to be about confidence. Women are more underconfident. They don't think they're good enough to self-promote. Part of it, the gender difference in self-promotional behavior also seems to be about concerns about how you'll be perceived. Maybe you won't be perceived as likable or a team player if you self-promote. So I think both things are going on, and I think it's interesting to think about where these beliefs are coming from and how we can like better understand them. So thank you.
Okay, we have like time for one more question. Has anyone raised their hands? I cannot see you, so if you want to ask, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask directly.
Hi, this is Anita Bernardo. I put a question in the chat. I may have missed this, but I was wondering what industries this represents.
Yeah, good question. So here we typically look at kind of STEM fields where, you know, it's gender gaps and labor market outcomes seem to be the widest, and where we're really interested in these like gender norms impacting people's behaviors in these kind of like stereotypically male fields. It would be interesting to look at, I think, maybe like more female dominated fields and see if we find similar patterns.
Okay, thank you so much. I think there is one more question for you in the chat, Jenny, but you can reply directly in the chat. Now we will move on to the main talk by Valerio. So let me share my screen again. Okay, well, thank you again for the presentation, Jenny. If anyone has more questions for Jenny, please feel free to keep writing them in the chat. Otherwise, you will also have an opportunity to ask her in the final Q&A at the end of the session. Now I will present today's main talk by Valerio Capraro. Valerio Capraro is an associate professor at the University of Milan Bicocca. He combines human experiments, mathematical modeling, and numerical simulations to shed light on human behavior. His work has been published in leading economic academic journals, and his book, The Economics of Language: How Large Language Models Can Reshape Behavioral Economics, is forthcoming by Cambridge University Press. So Valerio's talk today will be on this book, The Economics of Language. And Valerio, now I will stop sharing my screen so you can begin your presentation. And thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Angela, for the introduction. Let me share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Okay, can you see? Okay. Okay, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Christina, for the invitation. So as said by Angela, today's talk is basically about my forthcoming book, The Economics of Language. It will be published in April, and the outline is the following, roughly. So we are going to start by looking at some violations of money maximization. Then we are going to talk about the consequentialist assumption. Then I'm going to argue that this consequentialist assumption is undergoing an increasing criticism, leading to a paradigm crisis, which, to be overcome, it will need a definition of a language, of a class of functions, utility functions based on language. This raises the issue of how can we measure language. And here I will argue that LLMs will play a major role. Then I will develop some theoretical predictions which will then be tested in the dictator game and across decision problems. So let's start with some basics. So as you probably know, there are many violations of money maximization in experiments. For example, in individual decision problems, the historical experiments have been shown the presence of heuristics and biases, like, for example, the fact that losses loom larger than gains, the endowment effect, hyperbolic discount, and status quo bias. I said individual decisions here, meaning that these are decisions where the payoff so the impact of the decision is only on the decision maker. Of course, one can observe these heuristics and biases also on social decisions, but you don't need other people to observe these heuristics and biases. You can observe them already in individual decisions. When we move from individual decisions to social decisions, then another class of violations of money maximization emerges, which is related to the fact that some people have a tendency to act prosocially, even in one-shot and anonymous interactions. So, for example, altruistic behavior in the dictator game, cooperative behavior in the prisoner's dilemma, and so on. So this is very standard, and over the years, there have been many attempts to try to rationalize these violations of money maximization. For example, in prospect theory, in individual decision making, in risky decisions in particular, prospect theory has emerged as an alternative to expected maximization. So in expected utility maximization, you would have the product between the probability of an outcome times the outcome, and then you sum up. And this is the expected utility. But in prospect theory, you value subjectively both the probability and the outcome, and leading to this subjective value V. Another example is the hyperbolic discounting, the fact that people disproportionately value the present payoff more than exponential discounting would theorize. So hyperbolic discounting has emerged as an alternative to take this into account. And here the formula is the second formula on the right-hand side, where the present value of a future payoff is discounted hyperbolically. And moving to social decision making, there's a class of social preferences that have been considered by many authors that try to formalize the fact that people do not only weight their own payoff in the decision making, but they also weight the payoff of other people involved. So you might recognize here in the third formula, this is Fer and Schmidt utility function. And here the utility of a distribution of money, x. So x is a vector, is a distribution x1, x2, up to xn. So the utility of this distribution for player I is given by xi, which is the payoff of player I, and then there is a minus. Minus what? So the first term is greater than 0 only when there is an xj greater than xi. So this means that the focal player I is worse off than at least one other player. While the second term is greater than 0 when the opposite happens. So when the player I is better off than at least one other player. So this is an inequity aversion model, because basically there is this utility that appears anytime that there is an inequality from the point of view of the focal player. So these are three very different models, and it's very rare to see them in the same slide because they formalize three, so they concern three different, completely different behavioral domains. So risky decisions for prospect theory, intertemporal choices for hyperbolic discounting, and social decisions for social preferences and Ferre-Schmidt model in particular. But the point I want to make in this slide is that even though these three models are completely different in the sense that indeed they regard a completely different behavioral domain, they still share one common property. If two actions have the same economic consequences, then they have the same utility. This is an obvious property because if you put two actions with the same economic models into these formulas, you get the same utility. So let's call this property economic consequentialism. So if two actions have the same economic consequences, then they have the same utility. And this assumption underlies most models in behavioral economics. Not all of them. There are non-consequentialist models. I'm not claiming this. I am just claiming that this assumption is very, very common in behavioral economics, and it underlies, for example, prospect theory, hyperbolic discounting, social preferences. However, this consequentialist assumption is facing increasing criticism. And one major line of criticism is about the influence of language, of linguistic content on decision-making. So here, language is intended specifically as linguistic content, not as a tongue, as English versus French versus Chinese or whatever. It's fixed the language, and one can show that the impact of the words that are used to describe the actions or the decision problem have an impact on decisions. So this has roots that go back to almost half a century by now, because several theoreticians have observed that linguistic content can influence economic decisions, starting from Schelling, and then Crawford and Sobel. Then there is a book by Ariel Rubinstein, and there are models in game theory by Björndal, Halpern, and Pass, and there is a recent book by Clark. And more recently, so starting a couple of decades ago, there have been an increasing number of experiments showing that if you change the label of the actions in a decision problem, you can impact behavior. So for example, in the dictator game, if you change the way that the actions are described, you can observe that the average giving changes. Similar results in the ultimatum game. I'm focusing here on decision problems, so without a strategic component. So in the ultimatum game, I will focus on rejection rates. There has been work on the equity efficiency trade-off game. These are just decision problems where a decision maker has to decide how to allocate money between among a group of people, and one distribution is equitable, meaning that everybody gets the same, and the other distribution is efficient. So the total payoff is larger, but it's not equal. So people get different amounts. And also in this game, there is an impact of linguistic content on the linguistic description of actions. There is work also on the corruption games. For example, in this work led by Carolina, we found something that I think is very interesting. So here we have we have a corruption game in two frames, a bribery frame and a cooperative frame. So in the bribery frame, the bribe is literally called bribe, while in the cooperation frame, it is called a cooperation act, because bribery has this particular property that it can be seen as a cooperative act between for example, a citizen and a public official, that they do something together, so that they both earn, creating external and negative externalities on the population. So we formalize this idea into a bribery game, and obviously we found that people bribe more in the cooperation frame than in the bribery frame. This is quite obvious. And what we found that is more interesting is the fact that the people that change behavior from one frame to the other are the prosocial people. So we measure prosociality using the EXACO model of personality, and in particular the factor H. And what we found is that low honesty, humility people, well, they bribe, they try to bribe the official, and they accept bribes regardless of the frame, because basically they are not prosocial. While the people with high honesty, humility, they do not accept, they do not offer bribe and do not accept bribes when they are called bribes. But when the bribe is actually called cooperation act, they are more likely to offer them and to accept them in the role of public official. So anyways, there is this large literature, theoretical and experimental, showing an increasing impact of, so increasingly showing an impact of language on behavior. And in a review article that Joe, Matthias, and I published in JEL a couple of years ago, we argued that behavioral economics is in the midst of a paradigm shift from outcome-based to language-based preferences, because obviously these experimental regularities cannot be explained by any outcome-based model. So, but the question then raises is, how can we measure the linguistic content of a decision problem in a manner that helps rationalize human behavior in that decision problem? So what I want to say here is that the problem, the issue that language can impact behavior is well known. It's been known for at least, for almost 50 years at least. What is not known is the solution. So how can we measure this impact? So a theoretical, a qualitative model that I found it useful as a guiding model is this lens model. I published this model last year in Current Opinion in Psychology. And here the idea is that language impacts behavior through two main channels: emotions and norms. So these two channels are not independent, so there might be, and there often is, an interaction between emotions and norms. So if you are interested, it's not the topic of this talk, but if you're interested in the review, you can see, so basically the structure of the article is simply to show the experimental evidence in support of every path of the model. But I think this is a useful model as a guiding model because it suggests where to look at. And it suggests to look at emotions and norms contained in language. So to focus a little bit more the research questions, so the aim would be to try to quantify, to make the lens model quantitative via a utility function. And so in particular, to try to quantify the emotional and normative content of a piece of text. And of course, one can refine these questions by looking at different emotions, because of course emotions is not unidimensional, of course, and the same with norms. So how to quantify the effect of different norms. So this is the main article that I have on the topic at the moment. It's a working paper, but it's available online. So I will give a link at the end for those of you who might be interested. So here we are trying to introduce a language-based utility function, derive predictions in the dictator game, test its predictions across 107 experimental instructions, explore underlying mechanisms, and check robustness across games. And this is a working paper with my two colleagues, Roberto Di Paolo, who is at the University of Parma, and Veronica Pizziol, who is at the University of Bologna. So starting with the theoretical part, so the idea here is to start from the simplest model you can think of. So a language-based utility function that contains just two components. One is a material component that depends only on the material payoff, and the second component depends on language. So let's set a little bit the notation. So I is the set of individuals potentially affected by the decision. D is the decision maker. A is a finite set of actions. And pi is the payoff function. So here payoff means monetary payoff. So given an action and an individual, pi returns the payoff for that individual when that action is chosen by the decision maker. So important here is that an element of A, of capital A, small a, which is an action, is identified with the linguistic description of an action. So here, in contrast to the standard abstract approach in game theory, actions are not abstract objects, but they are specifically described by their, they are identified with their linguistic description. So the simplest language-based utility function depends only on the material payoff and a value that we call sentiment of A. So this is a number, a real number, that is associated with the linguistic description of A. So now we focus on the dictator game to try to derive explicit predictions. So why the dictator game? For three reasons, essentially. One is that it's an important social decision because it measures a trade-off between one's own payoff and others' payoff. It's a very well-studied game, so there are many experimental instructions available online. And this will be important for the experimental part. And for the theoretical part, the game is very simple, and this allows us to analytically derive explicit predictions. And the prediction is the following. I'll try to give you an idea of how we derived this prediction. So we define this sentiment index U in the following way. So first, let's fix the notation that S represents the selfish action, keep all, E represents the equal action, split equally, and O represent the other regarding action, give all. So let's try to reason together about this. So suppose that the sentiment of the equal action is greater or equal than the sentiment of the other regarding action. So we are in the first case here. I'm being deliberately vague about what is this sentiment. For the moment, it's just a number that is associated to the linguistic description of an action. And which affects the utility of the dictator. We will discuss ways to measure this number in the remaining part of the talk. So let's assume that the sentiment of the equal action is greater or equal than the sentiment of the other regarding action. Then the other regarding action is actually dominated by the equal action in both dimensions. So the monetary dimension, because if you keep half, you get more than if you give all. But it's also dominated in the sentiment dimension by definition. So in this case, the other regarding action is dominated, so it gets discarded by the reasoning of the dictator, which then is which then chooses only between the selfish action and the equal action. And the probability of choosing the equal action will then intuitively depend on the difference between the sentiment of the equal action and the sentiment of the selfish action. So this intuition tells us that this difference should play a role in determining the probability of giving. Things get a bit more complicated when the sentiment of the equal action is smaller than the sentiment of the other regarding action. In the second case here, because here you cannot discard any action, so the player, the dictator, will have to choose, will have to consider all three potential actions. But we can reason here as follows. There are two actions, which are the other, the equal action and the other regarding action, which push towards giving. And the third action, the selfish action, push towards keeping. At the first approximation, we can expect that the average between the sentiment of the equal action and the sentiment of the other regarding action will push towards giving, while the sentiment of the selfish action will push towards keeping. So at the end, the probability that the dictator gives will depend on the difference between this average between the sentiment of the two pro-social actions and the sentiment of the only selfish action. One has to be a little bit careful in formalizing this idea, because the sentiment of the equal action doesn't push towards this giving in the same way that the sentiment of the other regarding action does, because the economic payoffs are different. However, with some regularity assumptions, and this is the reason why in the theorem there is a bracket. I'm not going to bother you with the mathematical assumptions, but you can find them in the theorem. They are basically regularity assumptions about the shape of the distributions of the sentiments. So under these mathematical assumptions, we can show that the average giving in a population of dictators playing various dictator games, potentially differing because of the linguistic description, is weakly increasing with U. So we derived theoretically this association between this sentiment index and the probability of giving, or the average giving in a population. Okay, so we would like to test this prediction. And to do this, we need two ingredients. We need experimental instructions, and we need a way to estimate this sentiment. For the experimental instructions, we made a public call on the Economic Science Association and Society for Judgment and Decision-Making forums. Plus, we also did a systematic search. And at the end of the story, we gathered 138 experimental instructions, 107 of which met our inclusion criteria, which were quite inclusive because we looked at, we needed experiments where the difference between conditions was only verbal. So not visual, for example. For each of the 107 instructions, we manually extracted the linguistic description of the pivotal actions, keep all, split equally, and give all. And we obtained this final data set, which is formed by 315 linguistic descriptions of available actions that are hierarchically organized within 107 experimental instructions. Here, maybe some of you have noticed that 107 times 3 is different from 315, and the reason is that there are 6 experimental instructions of based on extreme dictator games with only 2 strategies, 2 actions, giving all or keeping all. So for these games, we have only 2 actions. So 315 is equal to 101 times 3 plus 6 times 2. And then we need a way to estimate the sentiment. And we have, we applied 4 methods. The first method is BERT. BERT is a language, it's actually a large language model, but it's different from the ones you are used to because it's a deterministic large language model. So it doesn't, it's not generative. So it's a language model fine-tuned for sentiment analysis over product reviews. Then we used MoralBERT, which is a version of BERT, which is fine-tuned over morally loaded texts. And we used GPT, which is seeing emerging use in sentiment analysis. And we also conducted an experiment with humans. We recruited over 5,000 people who rated the pivotal actions of one randomly selected experimental instruction. So this is why we needed a lot of subjects, because we have 107 instructions and we wanted about 50 ratings for instructions, and each subject rated only 1 instruction, so we got 5,000. Let me tell you a little bit more about how these measures work. So BERT given a piece of text, A, so the action A, BERT returns 5 probabilities, PIA, that corresponds to the probabilities that that piece of text is strongly negative or moderately negative, neutral, moderately positive, or strongly positive. And this was trained with movie and product reviews, so you really need to think about the rating from 1 to 5 stars here. And then we, given these 5 numbers, we define the sentiment of a specific action by weighting these 5 probabilities by -1, -1/2, 0, 1/2, and 1 to obtain a normalized sentiment score.
Valerio,
Yeah.
scusa, may I ask you a question to clarify this because I don't understand. There is something I don't understand.
Yeah.
So the probability is PIA is the probability that A is strongly negative. So is the probability that I interpret, okay, that action A as strongly negative, etc., or the probability that the language with which A is described, is interpreted as strongly negative, and so the sentiment, is very negative or so. I don't understand. It's different to say, I don't give anything versus is okay not to give anything, is right not to give anything, etc., etc. So is the weight is described, or the adjective you use, or a pure.
Okay.
I don't understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a very good question. And BERT and also the other models are agnostic about this. So these are basically neural networks that have been trained over millions of examples. For example, BERT has been trained over movie reviews and product reviews. So the number PI A is the probability that the model, after what has learned during this training, is the probability that the action A is evaluated by the model as strongly negative, moderately negative, up to strongly positive. So it doesn't tell anything whether this action is perceived by myself or someone else, or if we want to talk about personal norms or social norms, descriptive, injunctive, it doesn't tell anything about the underlying mechanism that brings that brings to this particular value. It's a value that the model has learned during its training. I will try to tell a little bit more about the underlying mechanism in the next slides. But for now, these are just a black box model. Basically, they are functions that allows you to calculate the value of language, but in a way that is somehow mysterious. I hope I clarified, I responded to the question, but I hope it will be clearer in a couple of slides. I'm going to, so time is almost over, so I'm going to be a bit quicker on MoralBERT, which is a fine-tuned version of BERT, which classifies language into 5 moral virtues taken from moral foundations theory and opposite biases. Then GPT, we simply asked GPT, we gave GPT the entire experimental instructions. So here there is the added value that you can give the whole context, which you cannot give to BERT and MoralBERT, or at least you can give it, but everything becomes neutral. For GPT, you can give the experimental instructions and you can ask to rate each action on a scale from 1 to 7, where 1 is very negative and 7 is very positive. So here again, we are being deliberately vague on defining exactly what we want to be rated. So we don't mention norms, so we don't mention emotions. So we just ask the model to tell us what it thinks on how negative or positive the action is, and then we normalize it. And we follow a similar procedure for humans. We ask a very similar question, and then we normalize from 0 to 1. Moving to the results, let me just quickly clarify that as a statistical approach, we use a linear regression with fixed effects at the study level. So these are the results, the main results. On the x-axis, you find the sentiment index, so the U. And on the y-axis, you find the average giving. So BERT doesn't predict anything, so it's completely flat. MoralBERT predicts quite well from the point of view of the statistics, but when you plot the results, you see that the results are quite homogeneous and clustered around 0. So basically, MoralBERT classifies almost all actions as neutral, while GPT-4 and human ratings are much more heterogeneous, especially GPT-4. And if you like regression tables, this is reflected also in the regression tables. The coefficient for MoralBERT is quite high, but only because the normalization is different. You have to look at the adjusted R² here, which is highest for GPT-4. We then made a series of robustness checks. So first of all, a lot of covariates that varies between but not within studies are already taken care of, already controlled for, because this is a fixed effects regression. We also control for instruction length. We did a leave one paper out analysis, and the GPT results are super robust. MoralBERT and human ratings, not that much. And we also looked at for non-linear approximations for using Spearman test, and the GPT results are robust. So one can wonder whether the ability of GPT is simply a reflection of the fact that it already knows the experimental results. So we did an additional experiment where GPT-4o was prompted, was asked to identify the paper and to extract the reported average giving from the instructions. And so we split the data set into two sub-data sets, and we found that sentiment index still predict giving even when GPT cannot identify the paper and when cannot extract average giving, and the coefficient is basically the same as in the full sample. So it seems that this is not what's going on. And maybe I have only 1 minute, so I would like to, so back to Christina's question, I would like to tell in 1 minute a little bit about the underlying mechanism, because in an additional experiment, we tried to disentangle moral evaluations from emotional balance. So we prompted GPT with the same actions, and we asked two things. We asked to give moral ratings independent of emotions and emotional ratings independent of moral considerations. And based on this scores, we created a moral index and an emotional index. And what we found is that the moral index is a strong predictor of average giving across experiments, while emotional index is completely flat. And this somehow reflect the early results with BERT and MoralBERT, because BERT is more based on emotions, movie and product reviews, while MoralBERT is more based on moral language. So we think that at least for the dictator game, the underlying mechanism is connected to norms or morality. We didn't go yet, at least into more depth here. For example, we didn't compare the potential different impact of personal or social norms, but this could be a next step of research. And just to conclude, we have several robustness checks also beyond the dictator game, in the equity efficiency trade-off game, in the ultimatum game, and in the corruption game. And so we hope to make in this way a step towards quantifying an important dimension of human behavior, because of course we communicate through language, and so to try to understand the impact of language and behavior is important for behavioral economics, and we hope that with this project we can make a step forward in this direction. Thank you very much for your attention. If you're interested in the preprint, you can obtain it from here.
Thank you so much, Valerio. So now, just for everyone to know, we have until 2:15 approximately for Q&A, and I see already Christina raised her hand. So Christina, you can ask your question.
Thank you so much, Valerio. I really like your research. I think language is very important. I have a question. It's interesting that you choose the dictator game, because the dictator game is very open. There is no clear rule, actually. Okay, it's not bad to give 0. It's okay to give, let's say, you have 10, 5, or to give 2 or 3, etc. So it's, and I think in the dictator game, I haven't tried it, but if you give different language labels, you may have very different results. I say so because I was very interested in the fact that in economics, they often use different normative messages. So is acceptable, is okay, is a paper I did with Jeannie Kwang, you know, is right, you ought to, is permissible, and so on and so forth. And so what we were trying to do is look at the difference between two games. One is a trust game, and the other is a charitable giving game. And interestingly enough, all these different descriptions don't make a change in the trust game. Because the trust game, there is a very strong reciprocity norm. And so language doesn't matter that much. Or as you say, sentiment, we may use sentiment, though I have a little doubt about the word. In the charitable giving game, it matters a lot. Okay, so in this sense, the sensitivity to normative language may measure the strength of a norm. Because when a norm is very strong, it doesn't matter if you tell me it's okay, it's permissible, it's acceptable, etc. And I think in the dictator game, similar to the charity giving game, we don't have, a strong, clear sense that, what is important to do, what we all agree should be done, etc., etc. The second thing but this is, I have to think about that. You talk of sentiment as primitive, like we have these emotions. And, it's a certain view of emotions that we may or may not agree with because basically, even if immediate an emotion is never primitive, it depends on beliefs. Okay, we don't have emotion for nothing. We have underlying belief that, they may be very immediate, but this doesn't mean that they don't exist and they don't determine emotions. So maybe the utility function should be grounded on beliefs and maybe how shared these beliefs are, and may connect your, emotion and moral beliefs or whatever, rules, because in the end, they are all belief, but they can be shared or not shared. But this is just an hypothesis. But thank you very much. I really liked your talk.
Thank you very much, Christina. I need to think more about this, but I completely agree. So with the first point for sure, in the sense also the idea that I had with the lens model, that language impacts behavior through, in particular, norms. If there is already a strong, tight norm, then language has little room to impact behavior, while if the norm is loose, then there is much more room for this impact. And so I completely agree with that. And it's interesting, the results that you found with the trust game. I'm very aware of your paper on the dictator game, as is indeed in our list of papers. But I will look at the new paper with the trust game as soon as possible. Regarding primitives, this is a very interesting question. I've been thinking a little bit about this because it's a type of question that I get when I present this approach, especially to people with a strong theoretical background. From an abstract and theoretical point of view, I completely agree with you. And it's interesting, this approach of trying to connect the two approaches through beliefs. So how shared are the beliefs in a population, which is a measure of how loose or tight a norm is. But I haven't thought about this very deeply, so I don't know exactly how this mapping, this comparison would be. I just wanted to say that for now, my approach has been very pragmatic in the sense that when we do experiments, we give instructions, verbal instructions to participants. The primitives of an experiment, if I can say this, are the experimental instructions. So we should be able to predict and explain behavior from the verbal instructions. Because pragmatically and in real life, these are the variables that we know, while we don't know the beliefs of participants. They are very, even if we ask them, we don't know whether they are real or not. So it's very difficult to measure them. So from a just repeating myself, but I'm having a pragmatic approach in this sense.
Thank you, Cristina, for the question. Valerio, I see there are some questions in the chat. Rachel and Christopher, if you're here, do you want to have the chance to like maybe explain your question? You can like unmute yourself and maybe pose your questions.
Sure, I'm happy to. Great talk, nice paper. As an experimentalist myself, I'm very interested in how I should write instructions. So I appreciate the input on that side. I put a whole bunch of different questions kind of as I thought of them through the talk, and you can use those as you see fit. But I wanted to focus on the first one, which is, I mean, there are, as you acknowledged in the beginning, there are some models of intentionality in perception fairness. Matt Rabin's is probably the most famous one, but there are others. And I kind of wanted to understand how your models were the same as or differed from theirs. Or are they similar enough that you could use your methods to compare, contrast your model versus their model and do a little horse race?
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. And I will look also at the other questions and maybe I can email a reply if you're interested. So models of intentionality. I've been looking at these models a little bit, but not so closely so far. So I cannot give an exact answer, but I think that your idea to try to connect the two approaches is promising. I cannot say much more than this, to be honest, because I haven't gone through I haven't thought enough about this, but I will. It's on my to-do list.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You might also find useful. I mean, there's a large literature on demand effects.
Yeah.
Right? And so this is less about how I make a decision because it might affect you, right, my counterpart in the experiment, but more about how it might affect how the experimenter sees me.
Yeah.
And that might, and of course, the language gives you a hint about how the experimenter might see you, right? So that might be another literature to kind of connect to, and again, show how what you're doing is different than, the same as, consistent with, goes beyond whatever the right.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So until a couple of hours ago, I had a slide on the demand effect, but then I decided to cut it because the talk is very long, and we speak about demand effect in the paper at some point. I completely agree with you in this regard, and so demand effect, as you also highlighted, contains a normative dimension. So it's about what you think the experiment thinks that you should do. So language can carry this normative dimension, this normative signal, and our approach can be seen in this sense as an attempt to measure the impact of this normative part of this normative signal, or in other words, a way to measure demand effect. So here, I think the connection is quite clear compared to the models of intentionality, that maybe there is a connection, but one needs to think a bit more about the details. For the demand effect, I see a much clearer connection.
Okay, we have 2 more minutes, so we might have like time for one more question. If no one more raises their hand, Christopher, would you like to like expose the question you wrote in the chat, or maybe do you want to expand a little bit more?
Sure. I was sort of interested in the larger logic of your thinking that you're challenging economic consequentialism, and whether that's really something that you can challenge in this way, whether your experiment actually has the power to do that. So language can have sentiment, but it has more than just sentiment. It can also have educational dimensions, like it can remind us of some factors we forgot to include when we were calculating utility. So do these experiments, which might show impact of linguistic content, actually challenge economic consequentialism, or do they merely measure the way the content educates our utility calculations?
Huh. Okay, this is a fascinating question. Okay, okay, let me say a couple of things. One is that in the lens model, I argued that language impact behavior through two primary mechanisms, emotions and norms, but they are not the only mechanisms. So, for example, there is a model by Farrow and colleagues which complemented this with spontaneous association and fluency. So this made me think about your example that I see as could be connected also to spontaneous association. So the fact that language can make you think about something spontaneously because of your experience, broadly speaking. But back to the question about consequentialism. So here, if I can get back to
Valerio, I'm very sorry, but we will need to wrap up.
yeah. Sorry, so just one sentence. So
Okay.
I define economic consequentialism in a very precise way here. The fact that two actions in the same in a decision problem have the same economic consequences. So if two actions have the same economic consequences, then they have the same utility. Your example, Christopher, is about the history that is behind the utility evaluation, which is very interesting, but is somehow is beyond the definition of economic consequentialism that I'm considering. Okay.
Yes, but your experiments never measure utility. They only measure our expected utilities. So that makes it difficult to test this theory in experiments.
Sorry. Yeah, but those are all about dictator games. So those games are all economically equivalent. So there should be no variation. According to economic consequentialism, there should be no variability depending on the language, while we find a variability.
Well, Valerio and Christopher, thank you so much for the discussion. I'm sorry again, we now really will need to wrap up.
Yeah.
But please feel free to continue this discussion afterwards. If any of you want to leave your emails in the chat for Valerio to contact you, please do so. So thank you again so much, Valerio and Jenny, for your talks today. Thank you everyone for participating today and for your questions. And see you next time, but a talk by Marta Serra Garcia in March. Thank you, everyone.